Afternoon. Today we're looking at Psalm chapter 20. The occasion seems to be that they're going okay, well, we're in Psalm chapter 20 today. The occasion seems to be that they're going into battle and making preparation. It may surprise you that the preparation has much to do with worship to God and prayer for His protection. Uh, the psalm really is a intercessory prayer. That is, those that are praying for the king and the anointed one. And if you notice that there are six requests, for verse 1, that the Lord would hear them or you, and then that the name of God or the God of Jacob would defend them. That is, it's a prayer for protection as you go into battle. In the third place, you note the occasion there, which I think is important. It's in the sanctuary, and so one would think it's a congregational setting in the worship service. And the prayer, of course, is that David perhaps is the one who would be strengthened, or Israel in general. And then if you look down in verse 4, that the request or the intercession is that God would grant them or David the fulfillment of purpose and counsel. And then in verse number 5, you see that the Lord would fulfill the petitions or the requests. So there's six requests there. And it's interesting, I think, that when we're facing difficulty in life, when we're facing something that is huge before us, because remember that going into battle is a life and death struggle, and many are going to lose their lives. And so it is a weighty kind of difficulty, and sometimes we face those in life. And preparing for them is in prayer. So let's look very quickly at Psalm chapter 20 for just a moment. And he begins in verse number 1 that the Lord would hear you. May the Lord hear you in the day of trouble. And I just want to emphasize just real briefly that that's the best way to approach whatever you're facing, whatever difficulty or mountain that is before you, that you prepare for that in prayer. And it's interesting, I think, that when you look at the latter part of verse 1, he says that the name of God, the God of Jacob, rather, defend thee or protect thee. Now, we understand protecting, but I think it's interesting that the psalmist speaks about the God of Jacob. We don't have time to go into everything about Jacob, but if you remember the story back in Genesis chapter 25, Jacob was pretty conniving and manipulative and underhanded. And he learns in life not to rely on himself and all that cleverness that he was able to do, and to rely on the Lord. And he learned that lesson in life to rely and depend on God. I think that's why he mentions the God of Jacob. You would think, would you not, that going into battle he might remember or mention the God of Abraham, or the God of someone of great strength and character. And so I just want you to keep in mind, because this is a great lesson to learn, that Jacob learned in life, and we need to learn the same lesson sometimes, not to rely on ourselves. And we're going to see just in a moment that David is going to talk about what men do rely and depend on instead of God. And so I think that's why he mentions Jacob. At least that's a possibility. In verse number 2, he says, send thee help from the sanctuary. And the setting seems to be that that's where they are. They go to the meeting place, to the sanctuary, where God would be present. And when they talk about help from the sanctuary, they're talking about they're not leaving alone. It's interesting too, bringing it into our setting, that that God goes with us from church. Not that we just meet God in church and then we leave alone, but wouldn't it be something something if we thought that God is going with us. In verse number 3, remember all our offerings. And again, you see it's the worship service, and there's a sacrifice being made. They're worshiping God. They're praying to God as they go into a fierce battle. And then he goes on to say there in verse 4, grant according to your heart, and fulfill your purpose. And what you're going to see in verse 4 and 5 is that after their worship to God and their prayer to God, they're confident about the victory in the battle. They understand that God is with them. The battle belongs to the Lord. And isn't that a wonderful thought? That you go into facing some real adversaries in life, and sometimes we just think they got the upper hand, they got all the power and all the might and all the money, and yet you see after worship and prayer they feel very confident that the victory is going to be of God. Notice verse 5, not only are they assured of that, think about just going into some struggle that you're facing in life, and after prayer and worship to God, you go in with confidence and with certainty that God is going to bring you out of it and give you the victory. That's a tremendous prayer. We're learning so much about prayer, aren't we, in the book of Psalms? Now notice this, because of the assurance and the confidence, we rejoice. Think about rejoicing even before you go into the battle, because you know you're going to win the fight. And boy, does that make a difference. So we rejoice in thy salvation in the name of God, and we set up the banners. Those would be banners of victory. I mean, think about doing that even before you win. Now, and the Lord will fulfill all our petitions. Look at the confidence that David has in prayer, and we ought to have that same kind of confidence and have that same kind of trust in God. And there, verse number 6, he says, now know that I, the Lord, saveth the anointed. He will hear from his holy heaven, and the saving strength rather in his right hand. Now verse 7 and 8, David knew something, and it's so apropos for today, I think. He noticed that some trust in chariots, and those really gave people back in those days the advantage, and some in horses, but we remember the name of the Lord our God. Think of that. You're facing overwhelming military prowess and power, and you're going in there, yet you believe that the victory is yours because God's greater than any of all that stuff. And yet we seem to want to rely on our military power or our wealth or how deep our resources are or what our numbers are. And we have to learn somehow to put our trust in God and have that confidence, because that's where the real victory is. Now, verse 8 and 9, they are brought down. Look, that's the enemies. The battle's over and they've lost the battle. They're brought down and fallen, but we are risen. We're victorious and stand upright. Save, Lord. Let the King hear when we call, and we need to have that kind of confidence and prayer, and understand that God will bless us and bring the victories and the triumphs in our life. Tremendous prayer. I hope that's been helpful today, and we'll see you tomorrow, and we look at Psalm chapter 21.